Hey, this is Steve Halleck of TikToking. I'm going to do a video of a real classic for you guys today. Before I start, please hit subscribe on the channel. I love it when you guys subscribe, when you comment, when you get in touch with me, share with your friends, do whatever. I'm doing these so that people can actually enjoy them and see them. And I'm really grateful to the people who are enjoying them. It makes it really fun. So without further ado, today I have an original Royal Oak from Audemars Piguet. This is the A series, which was the first production run of these in the early 1970s. And I'm going to go over what makes these unique. Before I do, let's start with sort of a little bit of history. This watch, as many know, was designed by Gerald Genta in the early 70s. And it was a pretty radical watch at the time. Basically, there were sport watches like Rolex, and there were luxury watches, which, like your Pateks and the other pieces that Audemars Piguet was making and things like that. And pretty much they were always in gold, and sport watches were steel. And that's just kind of how it was. And so this was a radical watch in that it was really the first luxury sport watch. Rolexes, if you're familiar with vintage Rolex, and even to a large extent new, there's not like a ton of finishing to them. They're really made to be tools, and their price point reflected as such. This watch was fairly expensive. I think it was about $5,000 at the time, if I heard correctly. I could be totally wrong about that, but something like that. And you can see it has the sort of standard, what we've come to know as Royal Oak finishing. We all take it for granted now. But these sort of polished edges and this kind of difficult to manufacture multi-part case bracelet and everything was kind of unheard of at the time. And so this was a real revolution in terms of watchmaking, and obviously has turned into a real phenomenon. I mean, this piece is basically still in current production, as well as the bajillions of variants within Audemars Piguet and the copycats and, whatever. But this is the watch that actually started it all. So let's start out on the back. You can see there's the A when they talk about A series. The model numbers will always start with A, and that's how you know it's the first production run. Another unique thing about the A series is, let me move the time a little bit so you can see it. The AP logo at the dial, at 6 o'clock on the dial. Now that you'll see was recreated by Audemars Piguet for the 50th anniversary piece that came out a couple years ago. They put the AP on the dial at the bottom again to replicate these original A-series pieces. So pretty cool. Now this particular example is really sublime. I've seen a lot of these, and to me this is the best one that I've seen. It was actually serviced at Audemars Piguet, so it's all like brought up to spec, and they're really the only ones that can properly polish these things to look like how they're supposed to, because you see there's the really intricate high polish there, and then these long brush strokes that have to create this finish on there. And just there are very few other people that have the ability to do that, and also are willing to take the time to actually do that properly. So one of the things to look for on an A series is the case is actually all one piece. So you'll see these are the screws that hold in the bezel, and the watch is actually cased from the front. So to take the movement out, you would take the top off and take the movement out this way. The new Royal Oaks, the backs come off, and the movement would go in from the back. Now this is important in vintage hunting because there's no way to swap this back, and that's where the serial number is. So unlike some other pieces where if you find, like, you can kind of create a parts bin A series that looks really good, or, original series of something, you just buy the case and then you buy like a nice case back and you put them all together and whatever. On these, the whole case is one solid block. So you see on this one, the case is like perfect. It looks like a brand new watch. And that's impossible to recreate because, again, that's where you have your A-series serial number and the proper back. So the other really important thing is the dial itself. Obviously, after 50 years, 40 years, I think I said that wrong before also. After 40 years, these can age in all sorts of interesting, sometimes good, sometimes bad ways. This one in particular is super cool. These started off sort of like a gray color, and the re-edition that they did a couple years ago was blue. This one's particularly neat because you can see if you look up close, actually the tops of these little squares, which is called like I think megatapisserie or something like that in French, they've actually turned brown, like a tropical brown. But rather than give the dial a fully brown look, somehow it plays in with the gray and makes it look almost blue. And it's also really even, the coloring across the dial. So you don't have any spots and you don't have like changes across the dial. You just have a really even aging, including the markers and the hands. So that's a really unique thing. And it's when you're looking for, a tip-top quality vintage watch, that's the type of thing that you would want to look for. Also on these, you can find a lot of times again, not only the case has been super kind of polished and destroyed, but also the bezels. Really important on these are that they're actually an octagon. It's supposed to be an octagon shape. But what happens is you can see these curves and angles on the bezel. After they get polished several times, it just rounds off and it loses a lot of character of the watch. So that's really important to note. So this is also one of the original bracelets. And you can see it's got this old style clasp. Many of you would be familiar with the clasp. It's pretty much the same clasp as used on all the old Rolexes. The new APs have like much fancier clasps. These were manufactured by several different companies. And some people get like all crazy about which bracelet is which. But as far as I've found, there's no super good source as to like which bracelet was supposed to be with which year and which company is better or whatever. They were all just kind of manufactured to AP's specs and then just put on the watches. So sometimes I think we, with the internet and the ability to sit and endlessly research things, we probably put more thought into recreating stories about these watches than the brands even did in the first place. But you can see here's a logo on the flip lock itself. Now, one thing on these bracelets, I have a relatively small wrist and I like to actually wear them backwards. So normally the clasp would close that way. I like to put them on this way so that the clasp goes that direction on my wrist rather than this direction. I find it to be like a million times more comfortable. But anyway, you can see on the wrist, and I put it upside down after that whole discussion. So this is how it would normally be. Sorry about that. And this is how I like to wear it. Aha, yes. This way rather than this way. That makes more sense, right? Because that way the clasp kind of goes on the flat part of the wrist. Instead of if you have it this way, it starts shooting up right on that rounded part. So you can see on the wrist, it looks really like a super modern watch. Like people, again, it's in the regular production. This is still a sort of avant-garde style. And the fact that this watch was around 40 years ago is really shocking. I mean, you can see how this would have been a major, crazy watch at the time. But nonetheless, this is about as good of an A-series as you're going to see. And they're really just some of the coolest watches that you can find. And actually, I think very reasonably priced If you look at Rolexes and Pateks and things like that of a similar era, I mean, the fact that these can be found for any sort of money that's, I mean, decently close to what brand new ones are, is pretty crazy, because there aren't a lot of these that are still around, and certainly even fewer that are around and in really good condition. So it's really, really just a very cool watch, and a totally, a vintage watch that you can totally wear like a modern watch. And so there you have it. That is an A series Royal Oak. The model number is 5402. And yeah, this is vintage at its best. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks.